May 26, 1905. After a journey of 30,000 kilometers, the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, 36 warships, including 8 battleships, reaches the East China Sea. The Russian fleet is heading for the port of Vladivostok, but will never make it. In the Tsushima Strait, 88 Japanese ships, 4 battleships, and 21 destroyers lie in wait. At dawn on May 27, 1905, one of the most brutal battles in naval history unfolds. To win it, Admiral Tōgō, commander of the Japanese fleet, attempts an unbelievably daring maneuver and succeeds. More than 100 warships face off in relentless combat over several hours. A fight to the death that will signal the rise of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese cruiser Mikasa is displayed in the city of Yokosuka, not far from Tokyo. 7,400 kilometers away, its former adversary, the Russian cruiser Aurora, watches over the Neva River at St. Petersburg. Although the ships were built by colonial powers using different designs, they have a shared history. They were tools supporting the expansionist ambitions of two empires. At the end of the 19th century, Russia pushes towards the Far East by extending its railroad from Irkutsk to Vladivostok, home port of the Pacific Fleet. The Russian and Japanese empires are bound to clash, because during the same period, Tokyo is eyeing the Korean Peninsula and China, where raw materials were abundant. A showdown is inevitable.
This is a clash between two nations who are industrializing later than most other nations. And as a part of industrialization, they have adopted the battleship. And the battleship is important for two reasons. First and foremost, it is symbolic of national prestige, but then, more importantly, the battleship is also, as a powerful weapon, something that allows them to project power globally. And despite this, the battleship is entering a changing era. Naval combat is about to change, and so what's about to happen in this battle is not so much a clash of a new era, but the last clash of an old era.
As of the mid-19th century, Japan had opened itself up to foreign influence. Albeit reluctantly, it attempted to modernize by reconciling new Western technologies with traditional Japanese values. The Army and Navy also followed this modernization trend. The Army was influenced by Prussia, but the Navy, which had once embraced French design, was now taking inspiration from the world's leading maritime power, the British Royal Navy.
At the turn of the 20th century, the Empire of Japan and the United Kingdom were allies. And since the United Kingdom had the best navy in the entire world, it was no surprise that the Japanese turned to the British for help. The British were making the best warships, and the Japanese needed to build a modern navy. And so Japanese warships are manufactured in England. Mikasa is a custom-designed ship. There's nothing like it in the world. It is a one-off, and it provides the Imperial Japanese Navy with an extraordinarily powerful warship.
Designed and built in London on the banks of the Thames, Mikasa is the most powerful warship that Imperial Japan had ever possessed up to that point. The new battleship is capable of greater performance than its contemporaries. It weighs nearly 16,000 tons. It's more than 130 meters long, its beam 23 meters with a draft of 8 meters. Its primary armament is standard for the era. 2 Armstrong 2x2 Mark 9 305mm guns, 14 Ellswick Ordnance 152mm quickfire guns, 10 of which are mounted in casemates on the ship's main deck, giving Mikasa a considerable advantage in combat. The ship's secondary armament includes 20 Ellswick 76mm guns and 12 Hotchkiss 47mm guns, as well as 4 torpedo tubes below the waterline. The armament is of British design. It's compact and reliable enough to protect the vital areas of a ship, with up to 229 millimeters of armor plating on its main belt, 152 millimeters on its upper belt, up to 254 millimeters on its 2 turrets, and 356 millimeters for its conning tower.
Mikasa greatly influenced both the further development of Japanese naval artillery and tactics in naval battles. Back in those days, people thought that a huge ship equipped with powerful guns guaranteed an easy victory.
Mikasa's mechanical equipment was also among the most modern of that period. A power plant with 2 Vickers engines and 25 Belleville boilers, generating 16,000 horsepower and a maximum speed of 18 knots. Range of action, more than 7,400 kilometers that the battleship can cover at a speed of 18 kilometers an hour.
Mikasa is a one-off. It has no sister ship. There's no other ship in the world like it. It combined the most powerful naval guns in the world and the thickest armor. You could say it was the best ship in the world at the time.
At exactly the same time, the Russian cruisers Aurora, Diana, and Pallada are under construction in the Empire's naval shipyards on the Baltic Sea. They're the first cruisers made and launched by Imperial Russia. But the Russian naval shipyards took much longer to build them, and production costs were higher than in Great Britain.
It would have made sense to order from abroad. It would have been cheap, fast, and efficient. But there was a problem. The United Kingdom was our main enemy.
The Russian cruiser Aurora and her sister ships Diana and Pallada were designed for 2 main missions: to attack the enemy's supply lines and to provide reconnaissance and support within a squadron. The Aurora is almost 127 meters long, with a beam of over 16 meters. It weighs almost 7,000 tons, with a draft of 6.4 meters. One of the ship's 3 steam engines is still functional 120 years after its launch. Aurora's power comes from 24 Belleville boilers and 3 3-cylinder steam engines generating almost 12,000 horsepower. The rudder gear was electrically operated, but could also be controlled manually or powered by steam. Maximum speed, 19.2 knots. Cruising range, 4,000 miles. The cruiser is sturdy and well-armed. The armored deck is up to 63.5 millimeters thick, while the conning tower armor is more than 152 millimeters thick. When the Russo-Japanese War began, the Aurora's armament included 8 152mm cannon guns, 24 75mm guns, and 3 torpedo launchers.
The ship's main armament includes 8 152mm guns on the upper deck and 24 75mm guns on the artillery deck. Optical sights had been mounted on the guns before its voyage to the Far East. The armor of those guns was 25 millimeters thick.
After completing sea trials, the cruiser Aurora and the other ships head for the Pacific Ocean to join Russia's 1st Pacific Squadron. But the Russians failed to assemble the squadron they'd hoped for. Over the course of its journey, the cruiser receives urgent orders to return to home port. The war with Japan has just begun. Imperial Japan is troubled by the expansion of the Russian Empire toward Manchuria and Korea. By 1896, Russia had even established a naval base in China at Port Arthur. On February 8, 1904, the Japanese fleet launches a surprise attack. War is declared 2 days later.
The Japanese declaration of war is timed to take advantage of the vast time differences between Port Arthur, Tokyo, and St. Petersburg. And what this indicates is that the Japanese have an enterprising spirit, and this spirit is coordinating a diplomatic effort and a military effort into one coherent strategy against a major European world power. The Russians had not assumed that the Japanese were going to carry out something like this, but they did. They surprised them. And that surprise came in the form of a declaration of war followed by a surprise attack. And what this is proving is that the Japanese have now figured out how to elaborate their strength on a world stage against a major world power. And this is going to change everything for the first half of the 20th century.
The Russians retreat to Mukden. Port Arthur is under siege as of August 1904. On August 14th, Japanese ships neutralized the Russian squadron of Vladivostok by sinking 2 Russian cruisers.
For Russian Navy, the Russo-Japanese War gets off to a pretty bad start in that the first engagement of the conflict occurs April 13, 1904, when Admiral Mokorov sorties from Port Arthur on his ship Petropavlovsk. Things go well, and he fights effectively against Tōgō in this initial action, but when he is returning to port, Petropavlovsk hits a mine and sinks, taking down with it the cream of the Russian Navy at the time.
In April 1904, the Russians send a 2nd squadron to the Pacific under the command of Admiral Rozhesvinsky. For the first time in naval history, an oceanic empire is sending a convoy of 30 warships on an urgent mission halfway around the world.
The plan that emerged was one in which the Russian Baltic Fleet would sail practically halfway around the world to engage the enemy in the theater of combat. And the idea might seem outrageous to us when we look back at it and understand it as being at the beginning of the 20th century. But for them, it was an era that was heavily characterized by optimism, where the sky was the limit. Jules Verne was imagining submarines that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. And so to us, it might seem like a wild idea, but to them, it was careful calculation.
From the Baltics, the ships will cover 33,000 kilometers, sailing around Africa, then crossing the Indian Ocean without real stops to resupply the ships, because the Russian Empire had no colonies en route for support.
They traveled almost 20,000 nautical miles in all, almost the circumference of the equator. The conditions were extremely difficult, in that we didn't have a single naval base or ally that could have helped us throughout the whole voyage.
The Russians know this journey is extremely risky. Their fleet is vulnerable. After long months of preparation, they set sail the 14th of October, 1904, with great trepidation and with rumors of Japanese warships lurking along the Danish colonial coastline, among them torpedo boats.
The torpedo boat is a naval technology that has only recently emerged in 1904. And these are small, agile craft that are capable of releasing torpedoes, which in and of themselves are capable of bringing down the largest ships in the world. So one torpedo boat represents a great threat to a ship. A swarm of torpedo boats, which is how they would typically attack, would represent the greatest possible fear for any man commanding a flotilla of large warships. And as the Baltic Fleet departs, as it's barely out of the Baltic, there is great paranoia that they will encounter what they know the enemy has, a squadron of torpedo boats.
Aboard the Knyaz Suvorov, Admiral Rozhesvinsky and crew are on high alert. This is the latest Borodino-class battleship, completed in September 1904, only weeks before their departure. The night of October 21st, 1904, the fleet opens fire for 20 minutes on what they think are Japanese torpedo boats. Instead, they are British trawlers and two friendly ships, Aurora and Dmitry Donskoy. Luckily, none of the 500 shells fired by the battleship Oriole hit the targets. A miserable performance by Russian naval gunnery. It's a disastrous start, and the Russians can expect no support from the French or British, who condemn their expansionist politics in Asia, making things even more difficult. At each stopover, they narrowly avoid triggering diplomatic incidents, which causes considerable delays and allows the Japanese to recover from the Port Arthur campaign. They dock their ships at naval arsenals and resume training for the final clash. In Tangier, Admiral Rozhesvinsky divides the fleet. The oldest ships will pass through the Suez Canal, while the 8 battleships will travel around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. The squadron will meet at Nosy Bay, north of Madagascar.
This journey is going to be an epic one, but it also introduces some epic logistical challenges, because along the way there are no allied nations that the Russian fleet can put into for support. In fact, along the way, there are very few places where they can take on coal, and this forces them into the position of having to cram every single ship as full of coal as possible. They receive some assistance from the unlikely ally in the form of Imperial Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm provides some repurposed passenger ships that will help make it possible to get there. But at the same time, the journey is long, and the journey is going to be beset with challenges, because in addition to having to deal with the wildness of the natural environment, the ships are incredibly uncomfortable. Coal is not just filling the bunkers, but also filling the areas where crewmen are sleeping aboard ship. The men are inhaling coal with each and every passing day. The ships are so overloaded with coal that they're crawling at even slower speeds. And so this outrageous journey halfway around the world to Port Arthur is going to be very slow, and it's also going to be one that's characterized by great discomfort for the men who are making the journey.
Early January 1905 at Nosy Bay, Admiral Rozhesvinsky learns that the Russian garrison at Port Arthur has just surrendered after 6 months of bitter fighting. They lose 5 battleships and 2 cruisers, sunk while anchored at port. They have no further naval reserves in the Far East. Admiral Rozhesvinsky's squadron is their last hope. A few weeks later, No one knows what's become of the Russian fleet, and some wonder whether they took the long route around Australia. But Admiral Roshesvinsky is actually on the fast track. His ship is reported in the Strait of Malacca, yet the Japanese await him further south in the Sunda Strait. He's heading for Camron in Indochina. There he receives strict orders from the Tsar to wait for the fleet commanded by Rear Admiral Nebogatov.
Rear Admiral Nebogatov is going to contribute with his flotilla a group of ships that are toward the end of their service life. They're powerful ships. They're going to contribute some meaningful firepower, but because they're older ships, they're moving at a slower rate of speed. Admiral Roshesvinsky realizes that these ships are only going to slow him down, and so he purposely attempts to avoid receiving radio communications from St. Petersburg because he knows those communications will instruct him to merge Nebogatov into his fleet. In so doing, it will slow him down and burden him at a moment when he wants to move as swiftly as possible into the Yellow Sea and move directly, swiftly toward Port Arthur.
For Roshesvinsky, the wait off the coast of French Indochina will last a month and create additional problems.
When the fleet reaches Cam Ranh Bay in French Indochina, they're now at the Yellow Sea. They're getting close to the objective, but they've got yet another logistical headache they have to contend with, and that's in the form of marine growth, incrustations on the hulls of the ships. The marine growth was made bad by the fact that they had to ride at anchor at Nosy Bay for a protracted period of time. And now that they've reached Cam Ranh Bay, they need to clear their hulls of this marine growth so that right at the critical moment when they're about to go into combat, they can move as quickly as they possibly can. Meanwhile, the Japanese are in port at the place where the battle is to be fought. The Japanese have the benefit of being there to conduct things like routine maintenance that will allow them the opportunity to clear their hulls so that the ships can reach their maximum or optimal speed. So the Japanese are in this position of having been advantaged by the circumstances, while the Russian fleet is in this recurring condition of being disadvantaged.
On April 5th, 1905, the entire fleet is on the move. Roshesvinsky heads for Vladivostok via the Strait of Malacca. He takes the most direct route because the ships no longer have enough fuel to reach Japan from the east. But it's also the most dangerous. Most of the Japanese fleet is now at anchor in Mosampo on the Korean coast of the Strait of Tsushima. In command, aboard the flagship Mikasa, is the victor at Port Arthur, Admiral Tōgō. It's often said that a spiritual bond exists between a ship and those who serve it. This may well have been the case for Mikasa and Admiral Tōgō Heihachirō. In December 1903, Tōgō Heihachirō is named Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet. He forms and heads up 3 squadrons, choosing Mikasa as his flagship. The ship will be Tōgō's home and headquarters for the next 2 years. Becoming the commander of the most powerful battleship of his time took years of preparation and discipline. The future admiral of the Japanese fleet studied cartography at Cambridge, attended the Royal Naval Academy at Portsmouth, and the Royal Naval College of Greenwich. During his stay in Great Britain, he understood what helped this country maintain its status as the leading maritime power. Centuries of experience in combat and highly advanced shipbuilding technology that the Japanese would have to adopt.
British standards, height, size, and arrangement of guns were very different from those used in Japan. So Japanese sailors were forced to eat beef and drink milk to become taller and stronger. However, many members of the crew wouldn't eat animal products because of religious beliefs. When the Navy insisted that they do so anyway, the sailors refused to comply. They confined themselves to the lower deck and declared that they would not come out. The sailors were removed and spent the next 4 years in prison, and Mikasa's crew was almost entirely replaced.
By breaking firmly with age-old naval traditions, Japan has succeeded in building a modern navy. Spartan living conditions and iron discipline imposed on the sailors turned them into a force to be reckoned with. The gunners who served aboard Mikasa were never separated from their weapons. They ate and slept on deck in hammocks suspended over their guns. But their efforts would pay off. By the start of the Russo-Japanese War, Japan's Imperial Navy had become a formidable power. Now, these two juggernauts will face off in a massive confrontation of 110 ships. It's a naval battle that will determine the political future of the region. The 2nd Russian Squadron includes 37 vessels, 11 battleships, 2 large cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Japanese combined fleet includes 95 ships, with 4 first-class battleships, 8 armored cruisers, 21 destroyers, and 43 torpedo launchers. At dawn on May 27, 1905, a Japanese cruiser on patrol south of the strait reports a Russian squadron heading toward the strait's eastern channel. Tōgō immediately sends ships to intercept them. At 5:50 a.m., he sends a message to Imperial headquarters. Weather today fine, but high waves. At 1:45 p.m., Admiral Tōgō sets eyes on the Russian fleet, heading north in the strait between the Korean Peninsula and Japan. The squadron has made slight changes in its formation. The starboard column with the battleships Knyaz Suvorov, Alexander III, Borodino, and Oriol overtakes the port column, led by Ozliabya. The Japanese fleet moves in to face them. If the battle isn't decisive, the Russians may be able to break through the line and make a run for Vladivostok. In an audacious move, Tōgō orders his squadron to turn to port in sequence. A single-file hairpin turn designed to block the Russians' path. But it also exposes the flanks of some of his own ships to enemy fire for a full 12 minutes, during which they can't retaliate. It's a huge risk, because the range of Russian 305mm guns exceeds that of the Japanese firepower. But the Russians lose the upper hand due to their lack of speed and maneuverability.
After the battle was joined, Admiral Tōgō has the opportunity to observe the enemy and the way the enemy is maneuvering. And what he observes is that the Russians' first 4 battleships are maneuvering almost separate from everyone else. And Tōgō decides to take advantage of that and go for the throat. And by doing this, what he decides to do is cross the T, and that is break from his inline formation to a formation where all of the ships have turned to broadside the enemy. And here's the Japanese Navy, a nation that is industrialized late, a nation that put together a modern navy later than everyone else, and they have just carried out one of the most difficult maneuvers of a surface warfare force in action. And this is one of the reasons why we remember this battle.
The Japanese combined fleet turns about face as if it were on parade. It's such an outrageous maneuver that the Russians are stunned. They simply can't believe their eyes.
People think that Tōgō employed the crossing the T tactic, positioning his ships perpendicular to the Russian columns. But in reality, the tactic Tōgō used was far less classic. It was inspired by Uesugi Kenshin, a warlord of medieval Japan, who used it to encircle the enemy in combat.
Taking advantage of his faster-moving ships, Tōgō will outrun his opponents. The maneuvering of the Japanese fleet systematically disrupts the route of Roshesvinsky's line of battle, ultimately scattering the Tsar's ships. This maritime orbiting will go on for 28 hours. More than a day-long ordeal for Russia's Imperial Navy with no signs of letting up. At the start of the confrontation, a pennant, the Z flag, had been hoisted over the flagship Mikasa. To the Japanese, it meant the Empire's fate depends on the result of this battle. Let every man do his utmost duty. The sailors rush into the passageways. 2 minutes later, Russian guns open fire. They're 7,000 meters from their target. Mikasa is hit 19 times, but just keeps moving. Unfortunately for the Russians, their shells produced no smoke upon impact, and the officers can't adjust their sights. Japanese shelling is more precise because their ships are equipped with rangefinders, and their direct hits are far more visible.
And the Japanese had purchased ships more recently than the Russians. And what that meant was that the Japanese were benefiting from improved optical rangefinders that were capable of directing fire effectively out to ranges of 5,000 meters. In addition, the Japanese were using shells that made use of shimose powder. And that was a powder that specifically preserved a higher explosive velocity of the shell, so that when the shell struck a target, it tended to flash with greater explosive power and set things on fire. And although these Russian ships were modern and they were armored, there were still wood structures on some of the ships. In addition to that, the Russians were finding that layers of paint on ships' structures were also catching fire. And this was especially bad because of the fact men on board the Russian ships still had jobs to do. It was necessary for messengers to carry instructions from the bridge to the various departments on board the ship. It was necessary for ammunition bearers to advance ammunition to the weapons that would fire them. So men are circulating all over the ship. Meanwhile, Japanese shells packed with potent shimose powder are raining down on them and turning these ships into funeral pyres.
At 2:16 p.m., from a distance of 4,600 meters, the Japanese fleet concentrates fire on the Knyaz Suvorov, the flagship of the Russian fleet. The quicker Japanese ships reached speeds of 16 knots, 30 kilometers an hour, compared to about 8 knots or 15 kilometers for the Russians.
The Russians are definitely in this fight. In fact, they pound Mikasa over and over again with naval gunfire. Mikasa sustains 15 hits during the course of the battle, but it's not enough to take the ship out of action. In contrast, the 4 Russian Borodino-class battleships are being absolutely battered by long-range and accurate Japanese naval gunfire. After having been pounded by the Japanese, these ships, they linger on into the evening, only to then be finished off by Japanese torpedo boats.
Russian writer Alexei Novikov-Priboy, who enlisted with the Baltic Fleet at age 22 and then served with the 2nd Pacific Squadron, describes what he witnessed. 6 enemy battleships concentrate their fire on the flagship, while 6 Japanese cruisers target Ozlyabya. Knyaz Suvorov catches heavy fire. The Japanese shells behave like flying torpedoes. They explode in 1,000 fragments and enormous clouds of black or light yellow smoke. They burn all flammable materials on contact, even the paint on the metal parts of the ship. Our artillery fire, the explosions of enemy shells, the groaning of twisted iron blend into a constant roar that makes the entire ship tremble. Knyaz Suvorov tries to change course, but Japanese shells continue to strike. Things are looking hopeless. Shrapnel wounded the men, killed them in groups, destroyed the fire hoses. They couldn't contain the flames, which were localized at first, and then became an inferno that consumed the entire passageway, from the forecastle to the quarterdeck.
For these Russian sailors, it's a living hell. They face the prospect of drowning when they go down with a sinking ship, and they also face the prospect of being burned alive. It's not unlike the battle at Mukden, where modern industrial warfare has created circumstances by which defenseless, helpless people are sitting there being battered by what modern warfare can throw at you.
But in the midst of this inferno, with the admiral wounded and most of the officers dead, the survivors keep up the fight. Tōgō would later pay homage to their fierce resistance. At 2:43 p.m., the battleships Ozlyabya and Knyaz Suvorov are burning. 7 minutes later, the Emperor-class battleship Alexander III heads north, trying to retreat from the line of battle. At 3:10 p.m., Ozlyabya capsizes and sinks, taking 515 men with it. The flagship Knyaz Suvorov then tries to break the line in an attempt to reach Vladivostok. The cruiser Aurora was part of the squadron commanded by Rear Admiral Enquist, whose orders were to protect the support vessels. Accompanied by the cruiser Oleg, the ship engages in battle 40 minutes after it has begun. The column is under attack by 8 Japanese cruisers and the battleship Shenyuan. The Aurora fires 2,000 shells and takes 18 hits, 2 of which breach the hull. Each is more than 4 square meters. The largest breach on the deck is about 2 square meters. The conning tower is hit twice, and the ship's captain Yegoriev is killed. "98 sailors are either wounded or dead. All of the ship's guns have sustained damage, but the crew won't give up. For 28 hours, the sailors take turns stoking the coal-fired boilers, and Aurora's captain manages to dodge fire by increasing his cruising speed. Rear Admiral Engquist breaks through the enemy lines and races towards the port of Manila with 2 other cruisers.
In this situation, the commander of the cruiser squadron, Admiral Engquist, made the best decision to not try to take Vladivostok. By returning to Manila, Engquist saved the Russian ships.
At 6 p.m., the 2 fleets meet again. They're less than 6,500 meters apart when the firing begins, but the Russian battle lines are disintegrating. Admiral Rozhesvinsky is seriously wounded and cedes his command to Nebogotov. Some of the Japanese ships, led by the battleship Mikasa, follow the mad dash of the Russian ships trying to escape and cut them off one more time. The final confrontation of the day is dramatic. Two battleships are lost in the space of 20 minutes. At 4:43 p.m., the battleship Alexander III capsizes and sinks. Only 4 sailors survive. Around 7:20 p.m., Knyaz Suvorov is torpedoed. Borodino is in flames. Following a massive explosion, it will sink. Only one of its 900 crew members will survive.
During the maneuver initiated by the Admiral, the Japanese ships fired with everything they had, and their aim was so precise that their enemy had no prayer of escape. For the Baltic Fleet, it was more complicated to fire their forward guns with their targets in constant motion.
As twilight falls, the battle ends. Part of the fleet still has a small chance of getting away. The surviving ships head for Vladivostok. Admiral Tōgō knows his enemy may still elude him.
If the Russian fleet had managed to cross the Tsugaru Strait, half of the squadron would have made it to Vladivostok. They could have conducted raids that would have wiped out the entire Japanese army in Manchuria, which is why they launched torpedo bomber attacks well after sundown. The stakes were clear to the Japanese. The Baltic Fleet had to be annihilated.
Night has come, helping small torpedo boats with spotlights track and destroy ships still struggling or trying to make their way to Vladivostok. It's total chaos. The small coastal battleship Admiral Ushakov refuses to surrender and is scuttled. The Russian cruiser Dmitry Donskoy clashes with 6 Japanese ships and is scuttled after sustaining irreparable damage. The armed yacht Almaz and 2 destroyers are the only Russian ships to reach Vladivostok. But Rear Admiral Engquist also avoids capture. The 3 Russian cruisers Aurora, Jemchuk, and Oleg make it to the American naval base in Manila, where they are immediately interned. During the fighting, the Aurora will have eluded at least 17 torpedoes. On May 28th at 10:43 a.m., the Nikolai I, commanded by Admiral Nebogotov, lowers its flag. He sends a message to his enemy. We ask to negotiate. the total casualties sustained in the Battle of Tsushima. For the Russian Pacific Fleet, 19 ships sunk, 2 ships scuttled by their own crews, 11 captured, 2 of them hospital ships, 3 cruisers, 1 destroyer, and 2 auxiliary vessels. A second-class Aviso cruiser and 2 destroyers reached Vladivostok. 5,015 men dead, 803 wounded, 6,106 captured. For the Japanese fleet, 3 torpedo boats sunk, 699 men dead or wounded.
The Battle of Tsushima is the final chapter of the Russo-Japanese War. And it's a final humiliating chapter in that we must remember that the following day, Admiral Nabokov surrendered his squadron to Admiral Tōgō. He did so they didn't have to see those ships go up in flames, and he didn't have to needlessly sacrifice the lives of the men on those ships. But it's one final humiliation in a war that was full of humiliations. The Russians ultimately decide to accept the peace overtures made by American President Theodore Roosevelt.
The Battle of Tsushima will have radically different consequences for Japan and Russia. Victory will elevate Japan's stature, with its capture of 13 ships renamed and integrated into the Japanese fleet. The clear domination of Japanese battleships throughout the conflict will also influence the naval strategy of its admirals. During the 1930s, the Japanese government will begin construction of super battleships like Yamato, the first of its class, expected to dominate unrivaled in the Pacific. For the Russian Empire, the long-term consequences of their defeat at Tsushima are disastrous. The Russian people's blind faith in the Tsar's invincibility is shaken. The Navy is demoralized. Opponents of the regime, like Trotsky and Lenin, then exiled in France and Switzerland, criticize the incompetence of the Russian leadership, racketeering by the Tsar's entourage, and the total lack of readiness of his troops and the fleet. During the Russian Revolution of 1917, the sailors of the Baltic Fleet, especially those from Aurora, will play a critical role in the Bolshevik movement's victory.
The men on that ship were demoralized by the routine. They were wondering why the war persisted and why they should be fighting, and what was wrong with the entire scenario. Their officers could have responded to these questions if they'd spoken with their crews and were themselves interested in these issues.
But as members of the aristocracy, the officers have no contact with the enlisted men. In that sense, class struggle was a fact of life. The Bolsheviks will know how to exploit this social inequity.
Aurora was anchored near a factory where there were many workers, so it was only natural for the crew to get involved in this revolutionary movement. And when the revolution began on February 23, 1917, the sailors of Aurora supported it.
On October 25, 1917, at 9:45 p.m., Aurora, anchored on the Neva, fires a shot from its cannon, signaling the start of the revolt. 12 years after the debacle at Tsushima, the Russian cruiser proves that the defeat it escaped was one of the first nails in the coffin of the 3-century-old Romanov dynasty and one of the underlying causes of the revolution. During that same time frame, Imperial Japan was on its way to dominating Northeast Asia, and the triumphs of its daring battleships were far from being forgotten.